I had always dreamed of moving to a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind with tree-lined streets, chirping birds, and neighbors who waved hello in the mornings. So when I finally bought my home in Willow Creek Estates, I thought I had found my sanctuary. Little did I know, my dream was about to turn into a nightmare. The first few weeks were uneventful. I spent my days settling in, planting flowers in the front yard, and getting to know the neighborhood. Then I attended my first homeowner association meeting. The president, a woman named Karen, stood at the helm, her presence commanding yet abrasive. She was the embodiment of the stereotypical entitled neighbor. Short blonde hair, a penchant for floral dresses, and a tone that could cut through glass. Karen began the meeting by outlining new neighborhood improvements, which were thinly veiled demands for additional fees. To maintain our community's prestige, she declared, everyone must contribute equally. Her words were met with a mix of polite nods and hushed whispers. I raised my hand to ask how the fees were calculated, and her icy glare told me I had already made an enemy. A week later, the trouble started. My driveway, which was clearly marked as private property, became a thoroughfare for construction vehicles from a nearby development. At first, I thought it was a mistake. I approached the foreman and asked him to redirect his trucks. He nodded but offered no promises. The trucks kept coming. When I installed a simple chain across the driveway to stop the trespassing, Karen showed up at my door the very next day. "That chain is a violation of neighborhood aesthetics," she snapped, brandishing a clipboard with a copy of the homeowner association rules. "You'll need to remove it immediately." "It's my property," I replied calmly. "The trucks are damaging my driveway, and I'm well within my rights to protect it." Karen's lips pursed. "We'll see about that," she hissed before storming off. 2 days later, I received a formal letter from the homeowner association citing my unauthorized modification and imposing a $500 fine. Enraged, I contacted them, only to be met with a condescending response from Karen herself. "Rules are rules," she said smugly over the phone. I decided to fight back. I researched local property laws and discovered that Karen's claim about the chain violating neighborhood rules was shaky at best. Armed with this information, I reinstated the chain and posted clear, private property signs. That's when Karen escalated. One morning, I woke up to the sound of banging at my front door. It was Karen, accompanied by 2 police officers. She pointed dramatically at my driveway. "This man is violating neighborhood rules and obstructing community access," she declared, her voice dripping with indignation. I stood my ground. "Officers, this is my property, and I have every right to protect it. The homeowner association has no legal authority to override property law." The officers exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable. One of them asked Karen if she had evidence of any criminal activity. Flustered, she stammered about neighborhood cohesion and community standards. The officers left, advising us to resolve the matter civilly. Karen's glare could have set my house on fire. That evening, I discovered my chain had been cut and my driveway gate forced open. I called the police, but they couldn't do much without witnesses. Furious, I installed a security camera. The footage I captured the next morning left me speechless. It showed Karen herself cutting the chain in the dead of night, accompanied by 2 men who appeared to be contractors from the nearby construction project. Armed with undeniable evidence, I prepared for the next homeowner association meeting. Karen had overstepped, and I wasn't going to let her get away with it. The next homeowner association meeting arrived sooner than expected, and I walked into the room with a mix of apprehension and determination. The space was filled with familiar faces, neighbors who had either resigned themselves to Karen's rule or were too intimidated to speak up. Karen herself stood at the front, her expression smug and self-assured. "Let's get this meeting started," she said, her voice dripping with condescension as her eyes briefly met mine. I waited patiently through the usual drivel about landscaping fees and noise complaints. Finally, during the open floor session, I raised my hand. "I have a matter that needs to be addressed," I said, standing up. All eyes turned to me. Karen's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before returning with forced enthusiasm. "Oh, Jason," she said, her tone fake sweet. "If this is about your driveway again, I'm afraid—" "This is about more than my driveway," I interrupted, pulling out my laptop and connecting it to the projector. A few gasps echoed through the room as the footage of Karen cutting my chain played on the screen. Her accomplices, the 2 contractors, were clearly visible. The room fell into stunned silence. Karen's face turned an alarming shade of red. This is a violation of my privacy, she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. You can't record people without their consent. Actually, I said calmly, it's perfectly legal to record activities on my own property. The real violation here is you trespassing and vandalizing my property. Several neighbors whispered among themselves. I saw a few of them nodding, clearly uncomfortable with what they had just witnessed. Karen's authority was cracking, and I wasn't about to let her off the hook. Not only did you damage my property, I continued, but you conspired with contractors from the construction company to do so. And let's not forget the fraudulent fines you've been imposing. Karen's composure shattered. This is an outrageous attack on my character, she shouted, her voice echoing in the room. This isn't about your character, I said. This is about accountability. Before Karen could respond, another neighbor stood up. Is this why our fees keep going up, she demanded. Because Karen's been misusing funds? Another voice joined in. Yeah, and what about those new rules she pushed through without a vote? Are they even legal? The room erupted into chaos as more neighbors began voicing their grievances. Karen's attempts to regain control were drowned out by the rising tide of dissent. For the first time, it felt like the community was waking up to her manipulation. By the end of the meeting, a motion had been passed to audit the homeowner association's finances. Karen's iron grip was slipping, but I knew she wasn't going down without a fight. The next morning, I awoke to the sound of shattering glass. I rushed outside to find that someone had smashed my car's windshield. A hastily scrawled note was tucked under the wiper. Back off, or else. My stomach churned with a mix of fear and fury. I called the police and filed a report, but they didn't seem optimistic about finding the culprit. Could be kid, the officer said with a shrug, or someone trying to send a message. That evening, I reviewed the footage from my security cameras. While the angle didn't catch the vandal's face, it did show the same two contractors lingering near my property earlier that night. The pieces were coming together, and it was clear that Karen wasn't acting alone. I decided it was time to escalate. I reached out to a local investigative journalist, Samantha Hayes, who had a reputation for uncovering corruption. She agreed to meet with me after I explained the situation. 2 days later, Samantha arrived at my house. She was sharp, no nonsense, and exactly the kind of ally I needed. This has the makings of a major story, she said after I showed her the footage and explained Karen's antics. If we can prove a connection between her and the construction company, it could blow this wide open. Together, we began digging into public records and homeowner association documents. What we found was shocking. A series of undisclosed payments from the construction company to a shell corporation owned by Karen's husband. It was a clear conflict of interest and likely illegal. With this new evidence in hand, Samantha published an expose titled Corruption in Willow Creek, Homeowner Association President's Dirty Deals. The story gained traction quickly, and soon reporters were swarming our neighborhood. Karen's once loyal supporters began distancing themselves from her, and the construction company's involvement drew the attention of local authorities. But Karen wasn't finished. Late one night, I noticed a drone hovering near my house. It seemed to be recording through my windows. Furious, I grabbed a flashlight and shone it directly at the drone, causing it to veer off. When I checked my cameras the next morning, I saw Karen retrieving the drone from a nearby park. I confronted her the next day in front of several neighbors. If you think intimidation will make me back down, you're sorely mistaken, I said loud enough for everyone to hear. Karen's response was to call the police again, but this time, her antics backfired. The officers warned her that harassment and trespassing charges could be filed if she continued. The fallout from Samantha Hayes' expose was immediate and overwhelming. Reporters swarmed Willow Creek Estates, neighbors whispered behind closed doors, and Karen's once unquestioned authority crumbled beneath the weight of her exposed corruption. But Karen wasn't going down without a fight. The Homeowner Association held an emergency meeting just days after the story broke. The atmosphere in the room was electric, a mix of tension, fear, and simmering anger. Karen entered late, her usual confidence replaced by a strained composure. She looked around the room as though searching for allies, but most faces turned away. I've called this meeting to address the baseless accusations against me, Karen began, her voice trembling slightly. Everything I've done has been for the betterment of this community. I couldn't stay silent. Betterment? I stood up, my voice cutting through the murmurs. You mean lining your own pockets at our expense? The evidence is undeniable, Karen. You've betrayed this community. Karen's face flushed with anger. You have no idea what you're talking about, she snapped. Those payments were perfectly legal. Then why were they hidden? Samantha's voice rang out from the back of the room. She had come as my guest, armed with documents to back up her claims. She walked to the front and placed copies on the table for everyone to see. This is proof of Karen's financial ties to the construction company. This isn't just unethical, it's illegal. The room erupted. Neighbors who had been silent before now voiced their frustrations. Accusations flew, questions were shouted, and Karen's attempts to maintain control were futile. Eventually, the board voted unanimously to suspend her from her position, pending a full investigation. With Karen sidelined, I expected things to calm down, but I underestimated her tenacity. The next day, I found my mailbox stuffed with anonymous letters filled with threats and insults. The handwriting was shaky, but the intent was clear. Someone wanted me to drop my fight. I installed additional security cameras around my property, determined not to be intimidated. One evening, I returned home to find my backyard gate wide open and footprints in the freshly mowed grass. My heart raced as I checked the footage. The same two contractors who had worked with Karen were caught on camera prowling around my property. I called the police, who promised to investigate, but their lack of urgency left me frustrated. Samantha, however, was relentless. She used her contacts to dig deeper into the construction company's dealings. Together, we uncovered more evidence of fraud, forged signatures on homeowner association documents, unauthorized fines, and even plans to repurpose community funds for personal gain. It was a tangled web, but the more we pulled at it, the closer we came to unraveling the whole scheme. The final showdown came on a rainy Saturday morning. Karen showed up at my door, flanked by the contractors. Her face was pale, her usual bravado replaced by desperation. "We need to talk," she said, trying to sound authoritative, but failing miserably. "I have nothing to say to you," I replied, stepping out onto the porch. "You're ruining this community," Karen hissed. "Do you think anyone will benefit from your crusade? You're tearing us apart." "No, Karen," I said, my voice steady despite the anger bubbling inside me. "You're the one who's been tearing this community apart, and now you're facing the consequences." One of the contractors stepped forward, trying to intimidate me. Before he could say a word, the police arrived, summoned by Samantha, who had been tracking Karen's movements. The officers quickly assessed the situation and escorted Karen and the contractors away for questioning. The aftermath was a mixture of relief and rebuilding. Karen was formally charged with embezzlement and conspiracy, and the construction company faced heavy fines. The homeowner association underwent a complete overhaul, with new board members elected by the community. Neighbors who had once been divided began working together to restore trust and transparency. As for me, I finally had the peace I had sought when I first moved to Willow Creek Estates. My driveway remained secure, my property safe, and my resolve stronger than ever. The battle had been long and grueling, but it was worth it to stand up for what was right. With Karen out of the picture and the homeowner association under investigation, the neighborhood of Willow Creek Estates began to feel like a very different place. The tension that had hung over every interaction was finally lifting, and for the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. But rebuilding trust within the community was going to be an uphill battle. The first order of business was a town hall meeting organized by the interim homeowner association board. Unlike Karen's autocratic style, this meeting was open and collaborative. Neighbors who had once been too intimidated to speak up now voiced their concerns. Complaints about unfair fines, mismanagement of funds, and Karen's bullying tactics came pouring out. One neighbor, Mrs. Harper, stood up and recounted how Karen had pressured her into paying for repairs that were supposed to be covered by community funds. "She told me it was my responsibility," Mrs. Harper said, her voice shaking with anger. "But now I see it was all a lie." Stories like hers were common, and they painted a clear picture of the damage Karen's reign had caused. The new board promised transparency and accountability, and they started by hiring an independent auditor to review the homeowner association's finances. Samantha, the journalist who had helped expose Karen's corruption, was invited to observe the process and report back to the community. Despite these positive steps, the scars of the past didn't heal overnight. Some neighbors still harbored distrust, and a few were skeptical that the new board would be any better. I understood their hesitation. After all, we'd been burned before. Meanwhile, the investigation into Karen and the construction company continued. New details emerged almost daily, each revelation more shocking than the last. Karen had not only embezzled funds, but had also forged documents to secure contracts for the construction company. Her husband's shell corporation had been used to funnel money from community accounts, leaving Willow Creek Estates on the brink of bankruptcy. But the legal process was slow, and Karen wasn't giving up without a fight. Her lawyer's strategy seemed to involve dragging out the proceedings for as long as possible, hoping the community would lose interest. It was a frustrating reminder that justice, while necessary, often requires patience. In the midst of all this, I found myself unexpectedly thrust into a leadership role. My neighbors, impressed by my willingness to stand up to Karen, encouraged me to run for a position on the homeowner association board. At first, I was hesitant. The last thing I wanted was to become part of the very system I had been fighting against. But after some reflection, I realized that if I wanted real change, I couldn't stand on the sidelines. During my campaign, I focused on transparency, fairness, and community engagement. I held informal gatherings in my backyard where neighbors could share their ideas and concerns. These meetings became a turning point for many residents who started to see the potential for a brighter future. On election day, I won by a landslide. It was both humbling and daunting to take on such a responsibility, but I was determined to make good on my promises. One of my first acts as a board member was to address the issue of unfair fines. We worked to overturn penalties that had been issued without proper cause and refunded money to residents who had been wrongfully charged. We also implemented a new system for resolving disputes, one that prioritized dialogue and understanding over punishment. But the most significant change was the introduction of a community forum, where residents could voice their opinions and vote on major decisions. It was a radical departure from the way things had been under Karen, but it was exactly what Willow Creek Estates needed to heal. As the weeks turned into months, the neighborhood began to transform. The new board's transparency earned the trust of residents, and projects that had been neglected under Karen's rule were finally addressed. Sidewalks were repaired, parks were cleaned up, and community events brought neighbors together in ways we hadn't seen in years. Despite these successes, the shadow of Karen's corruption lingered. Her trial was still months away, and the construction company's involvement remained a contentious issue. But for the first time in a long while, I felt optimistic about the future. One evening, as I was locking up my driveway gate, a small but symbolic act of reclaiming my property, I noticed something unusual. A car I didn't recognize was parked down the street, its headlights off but engine running. It sent a chill down my spine, a stark reminder that the fight wasn't entirely over. I grabbed my phone and snapped a picture of the car before it sped off. The image wasn't clear enough to identify the driver, but it was enough to keep me on edge. I shared the photo with Samantha, who agreed to help investigate. "We've come too far to let them scare us now," she said, her determination mirroring my own. The mysterious car parked near my house marked the beginning of a new chapter in the ongoing struggle. Though Karen was no longer in power and the homeowner association was rebuilding its credibility, her influence still lingered like a shadow. It became clear that her supporters and accomplices were not ready to let go of the power they had lost. Samantha and I began digging into the license plate from the photo I had taken. Her contacts led us to an address linked to one of the contractors who had worked closely with Karen. It wasn't much, but it was enough to suggest that her network was still active. Meanwhile, I tightened security at my home, adding more cameras and even a motion-activated spotlight. I wasn't taking any chances. A few days later, I received an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a typed note. "Drop this now. You don't know who you're dealing with." The warning sent a chill down my spine, but it also strengthened my resolve. Samantha encouraged me to share the note with the police, but their response was lukewarm. "Could be a prank," one officer said, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it himself. Despite the lack of action from law enforcement, I refused to back down. I organized another community meeting, this time focused on strengthening neighborhood security and encouraging residents to report any suspicious activity. The turnout was larger than I expected, and the support from my neighbors gave me the courage to push forward. Then came the breaking point. Late one night, I woke to the sound of a loud crash. I ran to my window and saw flames rising from my backyard. My newly installed shed, built to replace the one Karen's accomplices had damaged, was on fire. I grabbed a fire extinguisher and managed to contain the blaze until the fire department arrived. The damage was extensive but not irreparable. The fire chief confirmed what I already suspected. The fire was no accident. Accelerant had been used, and there were clear signs of arson. This was no longer just intimidation, it was a direct attack. Samantha, ever the tenacious investigator, connected the arson to a string of similar incidents linked to the construction company. Her findings implicated not just Karen's inner circle, but also higher-ups within the company who stood to profit from her schemes. Armed with this evidence, she published a follow-up expose that sent shockwaves through the community. The pressure finally culminated in a court date for Karen and her co-conspirators. The trial was a spectacle, drawing media attention and packing the courtroom with residents eager for justice. Samantha and I testified, presenting the mountain of evidence we had gathered over months of investigation. Karen's defense tried to paint her as a victim of circumstance, a scapegoat for larger systemic issues. But the jury wasn't buying it. The testimony from neighbors, the financial records, and the footage of her trespassing were damning. The construction company executives didn't fare any better, with several pleading guilty to avoid harsher sentences. After weeks of deliberation, the verdict was delivered. Karen was found guilty of embezzlement, conspiracy, and multiple counts of vandalism. She received a prison sentence, while the construction company faced substantial fines and was barred from operating in the area. It was a victory, but it came at a cost. In the aftermath, Willow Creek Estates finally began to heal. The arson incident spurred the community to implement robust security measures, and the new homeowner association board worked tirelessly to rebuild trust. Samantha's work brought national attention to the case, highlighting the dangers of unchecked power within neighborhood associations. As for me, I chose to step down from the board after my term ended. The fight had taken a toll on me, and I needed time to recover. But I left knowing that the community was in good hands and that I had played a part in creating a better future for Willow Creek Estates. One evening, as I stood in my backyard watching the sun set over the repaired fence, I felt a sense of closure. The fight had been long and grueling, but justice had been served. Karen's reign was over, and the neighborhood was finally free to move forward.